Well, it's a real delight to be here. I've been here since Thursday and enjoying your wonderful weather, at least yesterday, and getting to see some of Glasgow. It's my first visit, so I'm delighted to be here. I want to do this in a fairly informal way, so please feel free to interrupt and ask questions. What I want to do is talk about what I find to be 10 great myths of what I'm calling the civil society sector. And of course, the terminology itself, as we'll see, is itself in contest, and I use these words maybe too flippantly, interchangeably: nonprofit sector, civil society sector, third sector, and I hope you'll put up with this sort of flexibility in the use of the terms, but there is no term that is universally accepted, which is one of the problems. This is a sector that, at least in our country, and I suspect in this country as well, is heavily overlaid with a whole set of ideological perceptions. The reality is that very little data has historically been available so that one could believe almost anything about this sector. And in truth, virtually everything that you could imagine has been believed, and some very deeply felt and believed features of the sector have so penetrated the consciousness of people that it's very difficult to get them to recognize the realities. And this is not simply an academic issue. It is a very fundamentally important issue in dealing with this sector, including dealing with it in policy terms. And so we have politicians in our country who believe that we could simply shut down our government and allow the nonprofit sector to handle all of the problems that we're facing. And we have put that to the test, sadly, as you had doubtless read about, and it's not an amusing outcome. And therefore, the message that I think my work has attempted to portray is very precisely the message of this session, which is that we fundamentally need better understanding and better data on this sector in order to do anything at all reasonably with it and about it, and that we need this not only for the sector's own use, but we need it for the broader public's use, because there are some profoundly misunderstood features of this sector that are abroad in certainly our country and I think around the world. So what are these myths? They begin at a very fundamental sense. When we started our work, there was a very strong feeling that there is no such thing as a third sector, as a nonprofit sector, as a civil society sector. And it's easy to understand this belief because everybody had a different notion of what it is that they had in mind when they used these terms, and the terms were enormous. So even though there had been, I think, a general sense that something very fundamental had been happening in the world, particularly in the period, let's say, from the 1970s through the 1980s and 90s, that we had around the world been involved in what I've referred to in some of my writing as a global associational revolution, something that had emerged outside of the market and the state, for which everybody had their own terminology but no real sense of a sector. When you think about it, one of the problems that existed was this enormous terminological confusion. So every country and every region and every group of people had their own terms. Voluntary sector, very popular in this country. Independent sector, a term that emerged in the United States. Charitable sector, non-commercial sector. If you go to Central and Eastern Europe, this is the term that's used. And so the idea that these organizations could earn commercial income is simply forbidden. No such permission allowed. Public benefit sector, so some sense of the mission of the sector. Non-governmental sector, another popular term, very popular in the third world. Social economy sector, now a new term that's surfaced. And so the terminological confusion, in a sense, diverted us from thinking that these different terms really referred to different aspects of something that had common features. They all emphasized a different feature, and each one of these terms, in a way, focuses on one aspect of reality and then obscures other aspects. So voluntary sector, your term, makes it appear that this is a sector that is wholly staffed by volunteers, and therefore when people hear that people are being paid to do this work, they somehow think it's inappropriate. That must not be the voluntary sector because you have paid staff. But we all know that there are limits to what can be done with volunteers, and that therefore it is permissible to have a voluntary sector with paid staff. But the terminology diverts us. And similarly, non-governmental sector implies that there's a complete separation between the state and this sector, obscuring the reality of some of the funding structures. So the terminology is a problem. The diversity of the sector is a problem. And when we started our research and proposed to do an empirical study of the nonprofit sector, we got a lot of pushback because people said, well, we're not part of the nonprofit sector. We're environmental organizations, or we're human rights organizations, and we have nothing to do with these other entities, let alone the hospitals and the universities. My God, how could you possibly confuse us with them? And then on top of all of that, there is the data systems themselves, and particularly the official economic statistical systems of the world. You may not know this. If you have managed to avoid knowing about it up till now, you're lucky. But we're going to put an end to that. There is an international system. By the way, can you all see this? Am I in your way? I hate to. You're okay to move? I'm sorry. There is something called the System of National Accounts. Anybody heard of the System of National Accounts in this room? We have one solitary soul. So you have all been privileged to be free of this burden. And I'm going to now end that freedom. So every country of the world utilizes a common structure for depicting its economy. That's the only way that we have something called the gross domestic product, gross national product of every country that means the same thing, so that you know that the measurement of GDP in the UK and in Scotland is done the same way as it is in the US and in France and in Germany and in Japan and in China. That did not happen by magic. It did not come down on the tablet from God of what the GDP figure is for the UK every year. This is something that is built up by hundreds of economists in the Central Statistical Office. And it's a very comprehensive system, very elaborately developed. There are committees that meet every year in the United Nations under the auspices of the UN Statistics Division. I know when I first went to the first meeting that I attended of the Statistical Commission of the World, I thought there would be 20 people sitting in a little room, and there were 400 economists in a huge hall in the United Nations building. In that system of national accounts, they divide economies into 5 sectors. One of them is called non-financial corporations, financial corporations, general government, households, and then this strange one called NPISH, wonderful term in English, and it stands for non-profit institutions serving households. So, of course, if you are an early examiner of statistical data and went to the statistics, you would quickly assume that there is the answer to your problem. We were proposing to study, when we started out, the scale of the nonprofit sector globally. We went to the UN statistics bodies of data. The OECD publishes the data that's coming out of the SNA on a regular basis. And we looked up the NPISH data. And what did we find? Well, we found 2 things. The good news was that only 22 countries had anything recorded for NPISH, suggesting that there were only nonprofit institutions in 22 countries out of the 180 in the world. That was the good news. The bad news was that in about 2 seconds, if you knew anything about the sector, you realized that these data were just grossly wrong. They were just grossly, grossly wrong. So, for example, I don't know if any of you have been in Germany. Has anybody been in Germany and investigated the nonprofit sector? What do you find in the nonprofit sector in Germany? What's that?
Sorry, I've just been not investigating.
You haven't investigated. Anybody know anything about the nonprofit sector in Germany? It's enormous. They have these free welfare associations, Caritas, the Catholic organized affiliated one, the Welfare Works, another one. They run most of the kindergartens, most of the private schools, most of the hospitals, most of the daycare centers, most of the elderly care service. I mean, it's probably the largest employer in Germany. And the UN statistical system was recording it as 0.1% of the GDP. And with it recorded so low, the statisticians were easily able to basically say, listen, this is basically rounding error. We don't want to fool around with this. This is simply not important. Well, anybody, again, who understood the German nonprofit scene and spent 10 minutes and talked to anybody in that scene would realize that the data were profoundly wrong. So we then had to figure out what was going on. And we discovered something very peculiar about the way the statistics were kept. In particular, it basically came down in the definition of where you allocate a particular economic unit, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit or whatever. It came down to the question of how does it finance itself? And it turns out that if you financed yourself as an organization through any kind of market sales, you would be put into the corporation sector, either the non-financial or the financial corporations. My university, which is a very proud nonprofit institution, we charge, my students tell me that we charge tuition for them to come to my classes. It's hard to believe that they are required to pay such absurd fees. So in the eyes of the statistical system, we are a market producer of educational services, so they dump us into the non-financial corporation sector, as they do to any nonprofit in this country that would get significant fees for its services. Any organization that gets most of its revenue from government would be put into the government sector as a government entity. And the only ones that end up showing up in this NPISH sector are organizations that get the majority or the dominance of their revenue from essentially philanthropy, from contributions. Well, we had already done research in the U.S. that showed that that was not the heart of the sector in financial terms, giving away part of what you'll hear about later. So it turns out that that this system works for corporations, it works okay for households and government, but when it comes to the nonprofit sector, look what happens. Nonprofits get stuck into all these different sectors, and when they are put in one of those sectors, whoosh, they disappear. And therefore, there is no nonprofit sector in the economic system, in the economic data system. You cannot find it. It simply disappears. And so it's no wonder that we thought there was no such thing as a nonprofit sector. It was not visible in economic statistics. It was not clearly had common features. To the contrary, everybody emphasized the differences among the institutions. And so what our research has essentially consisted of, I like to joke that my entire career essentially has been the creation of a set of glasses, of lenses. When I take my glasses off, all the beautiful ladies in the back of the room get blurred. I can't see their beauty. They're still as beautiful as they were when I had my glasses on, but I can't see it. I put my glasses on and wow, I'm just bowled over by the beauty in the room. And so it is with these statistics. The statistics are the lenses through which we see reality. And when the lenses are out of focus, our understanding of reality is confused, blurred, distorted. And this is why I think this session is so important for you, because it is the creation of the lenses, the data, the both concepts and the data to bring those concepts alive that make it possible to see the reality out there. And so we went to work on a fairly large project, and we call it the Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project. Alistair alluded to it. It started out as a fairly small effort in about 6 or 8 countries, including the UK, to better understand the scale of this sector. And our concept behind it was very simple. We figured that if these statistical agencies could take your nonprofits and put them in this sector and obscure their scale, we could go into that data and put them somewhere else. And is it not working?
I think we're struggling a little bit.
Are you not being able to hear in the back? I'm going to be frustrated if you haven't been waving your hand and yelling.
It's a bit of a strain.
Want me to take this off? I don't want it to.
No, that should be okay. Yeah.
I don't have 3 hands, so how I'm going to... Do I need to? All right, well, let's see if this works. Is this okay? Is it any better? Okay, I'm sorry. Please, if you don't hear, put your hand up so I know it. So anyway, we went to work on a fairly small scale initially. As soon as we began to get data, this happened to be launched right around the time that European integration was happening in the late, 70s, early 80s, I think that's right. And as soon as we began to have data, every country wanted to have data because it allowed the nonprofit sector to represent itself in this debate that was going on over integration of Europe. The third sector was largely left out of that debate, simply did not have a voice at all. We ultimately have expanded this project into some 40 countries, and I will be talking in various points in what I have to say about various of those countries. The first task, obviously, was to come up with a common definition. What is it that we're talking about? How can you collect data if you don't have a coherent definition? And we realized as well that we had to have a definition that would work in empirical terms. It was all well and good to dream up wonderful concepts that would embody the underlying features of the sector, but if they weren't operationalizable, if they weren't able to be transferred into data, that is, if you couldn't equip statisticians with a definition about what they were looking for, that it wasn't very helpful to structure the definition in that way. And therefore, we struggled pretty hard. We worked from the bottom up. We operated this project with a team of associates in each country. The associates were supported by advisory committees. And our first task was to basically say, what in your country do you think of as the third sector or the nonprofit sector, whatever words you're using? Tell us what kinds of entities are involved in that concept. And then we put all of these, in a sense, on top of each other, and we searched for the common features that we could use to depict that set of institutions. And we came up with 5 key features, which have now been pretty heavily utilized in research around the world. And every time we added a new country, we went through the same process. And so we started off saying we were focusing on maybe not all of the activity of the third sector. We were focusing on the core of it, which is embodied in organizations, though we made clear that we were not restricting it to legally registered organizations or formal organizations, that we were using a kind of sociological definition. So an organization here is not 2 people that met one morning for coffee and had a good discussion about some policy issue. There had to be some permanence, there had to be some structure, but in different countries, the registration rules are either open or closed, and we didn't want it to live or die on the basis of the legal structure. So, but some notion of permanence, some notion of structure to the entities that we're talking about. Secondly, we were interested in entities that were, in some sense, institutionally separate from government, private. We were determined to avoid the definition in the SNA, the System of National Accounts, which defined it in terms of where your income comes from. We saw the problem that led to, but nevertheless, we wanted to embody some notion of privateness. And so we focused on being institutionally separate from the state and its institutions. Thirdly, very crucial concept that these are, we refer to them in the U.S. as nonprofit. The truth is that the right terminology would be nonprofit distributing. There's nothing that prevents them from ending up at the end of the year with more revenue than they had expenditures. Most organizations can't get down that precisely. But the key is the distribution. Are they permitted to distribute their profits such as they are to members, to board members, to directors, to founders? And the key concept is that these are non-profit distributing organizations. And I think that's a central notion in the UK. A fourth concept is that they are self-governing. Again, not an easy line to draw. There are obviously influences on every organization. At the end of the day, we basically operationally define this as the ability to put your organization out of existence. And so in the case of my university, our board could decide tomorrow to close down the university. That is in their power. We have laws that say that if you do that, you have to transfer the assets to another similar charitable institution, and I think the same laws exist in the UK. But the University of Maryland, a public institution, its board could not make that decision. It would have to go to the Parliament, to the legislature, and get that permission. And so this is kind of a fundamental test of, do you have ultimately the power to set your fate? And then finally, we emphasized some notion of voluntarism in it, but we were wary of calling it volunteers because it falls into this trap of believing you can't have paid staff. So our concept is that people who are engaged in this sector do so in some sense without compulsion. And so this differentiates a nonprofit institution or civil society organization from a caste or a family or a tribe, all of which are social institutions, but one is born into them. They're not. There's no element of choice involved. So our concept is that this is a sector, that there is a sector. It's a fairly broad one. This definition covers a wide array of institutions, all of which fulfill all five. It's not a Chinese menu where you pick one or two. You have to satisfy all five. And with that definition, it includes personal social services. It even includes trade associations, bankers association, lawyers association. It includes some hospitals if they fulfill these criteria. We have great difficulty sort of differentiating hospitals, certainly in your country and in others. Museums, foundations, professional organizations, human rights, environment. And we have tested these five criteria in each one of these fields. And that's the heart of our work, is to satisfy ourselves that we're picking up the entities that really do satisfy these criteria. And so in some countries, we have hospitals, some of which are nonprofit, some of which are public, that is, they're government hospitals, and some of which are for-profit. That would describe my country. But this definition would allow us to differentiate which ones are nonprofit and to pull those out. And we pull them out because we think that that characteristic of being a nonprofit institution is a meaningful and important concept around which we should organize data, because we can see that sector as a distinctive set of institutions with special qualities. Any questions about all of this?
Actually, I have a little question. You said about North Castle family.
I'm sorry?
Okay, I've got a question about the non-compulsory
Mm-hmm.
and the caste or family. How do religions fall into that? Because I mean, certain religions do a lot of work.
Yeah.
Some of them don't. If you want to leave the religion, then you can, end up being a social outcast. So.
Yeah. We would include religion. We would also include religiously affiliated nonprofit organizations, but we would treat as religion not the service agencies, but the places of worship. We would not include state churches, where it's obligatory to be a member of the church. But places where you can, in fact, leave the church, whatever the social consequences, would include those as nonprofit institutions. So
are you not then excluding certain organisations that do have a non-profit role, but if they're attached to a religion that has those kind of rules?
I'm not sure what kind of rules you mean, but it's a question in this case of where we put them. So we have a category of hospitals. We also have religiously affiliated hospitals. We would put the religiously affiliated hospitals together with the other hospitals to get a picture of what does the nonprofit hospital sector look like. Separate from that, we have places of worship, congregations, churches, mosques, synagogues, whatever. They are also nonprofit if they fulfill these five criteria. They're organizations, they're nonprofit distributing, and they are non-compulsory. What would not be included would be a compulsory church, that is in a state church, where either through taxes or other means you are compelled, in order to be a citizen, to be a member of that church. So I think the definition would include most churches, except in countries where there is a legal obligation to be a member of the church. And I don't know that there are a lot of countries, even ones with state churches, that make it a legal obligation. Typically there is some kind of opt-out with whatever threat of damnation and ending up in Hades that might be accompanying it. Does that answer? Okay, for now. Okay, let's go ahead on. The second myth has to do with what does this sector do. And the mythology is that this is mostly about services, that this is really the function of the third sector. It's to provide aid to the poor or health care or some kind of service. And interestingly, many of the theories that have emerged in the academic world about this sector do the same thing. They emphasize that mythology that really this is really about providing services. And in our country, there's been a big dispute over whether nonprofits can engage in advocacy and political activity. And it's born out of this sense of what is the sector about. We have 3 different economic theories that have emerged, and I won't burden you with the details of these, but they are, most of them, hinged to classical economic theory, which is all about, at its base, why do we need government? Classical economic theory basically argues that the most important thing in society is the market. The market produces what we need to eat and drink and so forth. And only when the market fails do we need to think about supporting the state. And I think you've probably heard some of this argumentation from your recent governments. So that theory basically says that you have a need for governments where you have so-called public goods, goods that are produced and can be consumed by everybody even if they don't pay for them. And the classic example is clean air. Everybody needs it, but once you produce it, why does anybody need to pay for it? It's available to everybody. And so the market fails, and so this is where you get this term market failure. And therefore you need government to do those things that the market doesn't produce enough of. It leaves unsatisfied demand. And this one theory argues that, well, there's a failure of government as well, because in a democracy you require majority support, and frequently there's not majority support for something that some group wants, and therefore it may be the opera, it may be a good symphony, it may be certain religious beliefs, whatever. The market doesn't produce them, the government doesn't produce them, therefore we have this vehicle of the nonprofit sector that produces them. But it's very heavily service-oriented. There's another theory that says, no, the reason we have nonprofits is that there are certain situations where the consumer of goods is not the same person as the purchaser. Classic examples, nursing home care or daycare. And therefore, the non-distribution constraint of the nonprofit sector gives people confidence that the provider is not in it just for the profit, and therefore you're going to get a higher quality of service, and that's why people choose nonprofits. And then there's a third theory, a supply-side theory, that says, well, that's all and good on the demand side, but why do people come forth to form these organizations? Who's going to have the incentive to do that when they can't get any profit out of it? And this is a whole set of theories that says, well, there are some reasons why people would produce services for which they get little profit, and those features have to do with they want to entice people into a religious community or into some other kind of community, and that's why they come forward. The central point here, and I've done, I'm sure, great damage to the description of these theories because they're a little more complicated, but I think that's the essence of them. They all emphasize the service role of the sector. And this is, again, a profoundly important concept because it affects, again, what people think of as legitimate action by the nonprofit sector. Well, it turns out that the role of this sector goes well beyond service provision, and we have data on this. I'm not special quality of social. And then finally, there is the role that these organizations play as a value guardian, as a guardian of a particular value in society, and it's the value of private initiative for the public good. And if you think of it, this really distinguishes these organizations from all other organizations in society. The public sector, for sure, is supposed to at least support the common good, the public good, but it mobilizes collective action for that purpose and requires agreement at a significant level, even in a democracy. The private sector, business sector, certainly does mobilize private initiative, but it mobilizes private initiative for the private good. Unique among the sectors is the nonprofit's role, which mobilizes private initiative, but for the public good, for the common good. So this is really a distinctive feature that we all need to remember when we think about this sector. And so it's not the case that the civil society sector is only about services. It is about a lot more, which sort of gives it special value. So third, we'll move more quickly as we go through this. The third sector is the one where data begins to really become important. And this is the very profound belief, at least it was when we started our work, that this is a pretty trivial sector. It's kind of nice, but it's not anything to crow about in terms of its scale or economic importance. And so if we're concerned about jobs and we're concerned about the economy, we shouldn't pay a lot of attention to the third sector because that's not what it's about. This is the myth. And so it shouldn't surprise you to learn that this myth has been, I think, pretty severely blasted by the research that we've done through the years. And again, we've been working in a significant number of countries, including, where is the UK? There it is, and Ireland as well. We've done a worldwide investigation of the scale of the nonprofit sector. And let me just give you a few of the results of this work. The results have been captured in a number of books. This is one of the more recent ones. We're now at work. This is volume 2. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. This is volume 2 of the series of books. Somewhere it says volume 2, right there. We're now in the middle of volume 3, updating the data. What we found was really quite striking. First of all, we have in this sector across the world, in the 30 or 40 countries that we had data on when we put these figures to 40 countries, 48.5 million full-time equivalent jobs. We convert all of the workforce into full-time equivalent positions to take account of the fact that some people work part-time and some people work full-time. That's nearly 5% of the economically active population in these countries. Anytime you have a sector that employs 5% of the population or contributes 5% of the GDP, you have a very significant economic sector. When we put it all together and compare it to the GDP of countries, in terms of the revenue of this sector, it turns out to be the 5th largest economy in the world. Here's the nonprofit sector, 41 countries, $4.1 trillion of revenues that it brings in. This puts it just behind Japan as an economy, ahead of Russia, ahead of Germany, ahead of the UK, about almost twice as big as the economy of the UK. And so we're talking about a set of institutions that at the global level is pretty substantial. Another thing that we did just for comparison is to compare the workforce of nonprofit institutions in different countries to the workforce in the largest private company. The largest private company gets a lot of attention politically and socially. So where does the nonprofit sector stand in terms of the largest private company in each one of these countries? So here's our 48.5 million nonprofit employees. I actually knocked off the half just to be fair to the private companies. Here are the cumulative size of the largest private company's workforce in, I think we had at this point 37 countries for which we were able to get data. And as you can see, 48 million workers in these countries, same countries, about 4 million private sector employees in the largest private firm. And it gives you, again, a sense of the scale of this sector globally. Some of you are probably thinking, well, the U.S. is in there, so it's distorting the picture. And this is the fourth myth, that civil society organizations are chiefly an American phenomenon. I probably could throw in chiefly an American or other Anglo-Saxon UK phenomenon, but are far less in evidence in other countries. It's a very widespread belief. Americans truly, truly believe that we are distinctive in the world, that we are the only country that has a nonprofit sector. When we started this work, that was an absolutely profound belief. And if we're not the only one, we're certainly the largest one in the world. And that you poor Europeans, particularly ones on the continent, took a wrong turn compared to us. We were smart enough to keep a strong nonprofit sector to which we ascribed great strengths. You all went the route of government, and you created welfare states, and you lost this wonderful tradition of voluntarism and individual initiative. That's the belief. And certainly the belief is that for all intents and purposes, there certainly should not be any nonprofit sector in the Scandinavian countries because they truly are real, solid, substantial welfare states. So that's the mythology. So like all mythology, it's just terrific as long as you don't have any data to challenge it. So we had, several hundred years of internalizing this belief. So it's been hard to shake it. The data are very contrary. To be sure, the U.S. has a huge nonprofit sector, much larger than many Americans believe. Whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button. This is the workforce of the nonprofit sector compared to the other sectors of the American economy. And you can see with volunteers included and converted to full-time equivalent workers, the nonprofit sector in the U.S. is the largest sector of any of our 18 industries into which our data are divided. And if you aren't happy including the volunteers and want to just focus on the paid staff, it's about 13.5 million, and it is the third largest right behind manufacturing, but ahead of all these industries: construction, finance, transportation and warehousing, agriculture for sure. So it's a big deal. There's no question that it's a very significant economic force. But when you throw the U.S. up against the other countries, some enormous surprises emerge. And this is now from, I think, 40 countries altogether. It's the share of the workforce, or really it's the share of the economically active population, because in some countries, particularly less developed countries, the formal labor force is a small part of the economically active population because they have huge black market activities that are outside the labor force. But you have to go down pretty far to get to the U.S. Here's the U.S. 9.2%. This is all normalized against the economically active population. So it's not absolute numbers. It's the percent of the labor force, essentially, that is employed in the nonprofit sector. So we're down here behind Sweden, behind New Zealand. You'll notice that Sweden has a larger proportion of volunteers, and this is one of the reasons that we've downplayed and understated the scale of the nonprofit sector in Scandinavia. There's a tendency to focus on paid employment and to ignore the volunteers. They have huge volunteer involvement in their third sector. The other thing to notice is that all of these welfare states turn out to have the largest nonprofit sectors. And this is therefore a fundamental challenge to the whole concept of the European welfare state, particularly in Northern Europe, but even as well here in the UK. And there's 30 years of analysis of the welfare state in Europe that has never acknowledged the role of the third sector in the European welfare state. It's astounding. And this is back to my glasses analogy. The glasses were not allowing us to see what was right in front of everyone's eyes. Europe did not have a welfare state. It had a welfare partnership and built a very elaborate welfare partnership that in certain ways made a lot of sense. That is, utilizing the state to generate revenues, using a democratic political system to set priorities, but then turning to the third sector to actually deliver the services, on the theory that the third sector could deliver them at a much lower, smaller scale, much more human scale, with perhaps more sensitivity, more diversity. That whole concept was missing from our analysis. And this again goes back to the theme of this series, the importance of data to bring reality into focus and to allow people to really understand, what they're living through. We have data going all the way down to other countries. I should have pointed out the UK in this chart. I think I had it circled. It's not at the bottom by any means. Anybody see the UK? There it is. It's pretty far up there, ahead of the US in terms of the scale, including the work of volunteers. It's smaller in terms of paid staff. I don't know if that fits your understanding of the sector here. We have now, having produced these data, having produced a series of books, having them published by noted publishing houses and having them peer-reviewed, we're able to go back to the United Nations Statistics Division, the people who oversee the system of national accounts that we talked about. And I remember one afternoon we brought the whole stack of these books. We had country studies, we had overview books, threw them on the table of the head of the Statistics Division, said, here's our data, here's your data. One of us is wrong. We think it's you. You should be embarrassed to be putting out data that is so misleading the world about the scale of the sector. And this is not rounding area anymore. This is, these are the largest employers in your countries, and you're not reporting on it. How can you do that? And out of that conversation, I don't know if you can see it, we were ultimately able to convince them that they needed to change the system of national accounts. At least they needed to introduce something called a satellite account. And so we wrote for them, and they issued something called the Handbook on Nonprofit Institutions in the System of National Accounts, published by the United Nations in 2003. It is now an official part of the SNA, the System of National Accounts, and we have been working for the last 10 years, 12 years, implementing this handbook in countries around the world. I should put as a footnote that we have yet to convince the Central Statistical Office of the UK to do this. And if you want a good advocacy challenge, I would invite you to join us. We are making another run at the CSO with the support of the European Union that has funded a research project that I'm involved in that is attempting to improve the data across Europe on the third sector and do it, again, through the official statistical system. And we're now involved in an update, just as a side note, to this UN handbook. In 2008, the UN went through a major revision of the system of national accounts. And the good news from the point of view of third sector is that they essentially adopted and incorporated into the core of the SNA several innovations that make it easier now for statistical agencies to locate and report on nonprofit institutions using the definition that we had built into our research project. And they specified that countries are supposed to so-called subsector these different sectors into which nonprofit institutions are now assigned. If you remember from that chart, many nonprofits get assigned to the corporation sector, to the government sector, to the other sectors. The countries are now supposed to pull them out, which requires that they identify them and create separate tables in which the nonprofit institutions are broken out. And this is an enormous step because it will facilitate all of us going into those databases and pulling out the nonprofit sector, having it sort of arrayed for us by the statistical authority. So this is enormous for those of us crazy enough to be focused on data in this sector. This is just an enormous breakthrough. And we have now put together one recent publication in which we tapped into the 16 or 17 countries that have begun to produce these so-called satellite accounts. A satellite account essentially is the process of organizing data around a different concept than the one that's built into the core of the SNA. So we weren't really able to knock them completely off their existing structures. but we were able to get them to make it easier for us to produce satellite accounts on nonprofit institutions. And have begun to get data now, not from our team of researchers, but from the statistical offices of these countries. And the good news is that it's generating a picture very consistent with what came out of our research, almost down to the second decimal point. So the estimate of the GDP contribution of the third sector from the statistical offices now is about 4.5% of GDP. Ours was 4.6%. So we're pretty close. This is, of course, only 16 countries. It's not the entire universe. And you can see that some of the patterns that came out of our research remain consistent with the patterns coming out of the statistical offices. The U.S. is not number one. Surprising, of course, is Mozambique, which is unusual, and it's a product of a phenomenon in the third world where significant amounts of international assistance are bolstering a fairly robust third sector. But you can see the size of the European or European-inspired countries in the scale of the nonprofit sector in these countries. So, what comes out of this data is not employment data. All of our data has been employment data. We thought the best way to measure the sector was to measure the activity, and the activity was reflected in employment. This data comes out with financial data, contribution to GDP, and you can see the contribution to GDP of the third sector compared to other industries. And again, it makes a similar point that compared to other industries in the countries that we have data on, this is the 8-country average. The third sector is right up there with construction, close to financial intermediation. This is all of banking, all of insurance, all of stock exchanges, and almost as large as transport and storage. And when you look in particular fields, as we were able to do in some countries, you can get an even bigger sense of the contribution that nonprofits are making in particular fields. This shows in Belgium the share of all value added in social services produced by nonprofits as compared to other sectors of for-profit and government. And it's 2/3 of the value added in social services, 53% in sports and recreation, 42% in health. So again, this myth of the third sector being a trivial presence economically turns out to be just that, a myth. The data do not support it. To the contrary, they suggest a sector of enormous size, of a size that should allow it to go into the political arena and basically say, in a time of economic distress, this is a sector that generates significant employment and should be a focus of attention. This brings us to the sixth myth, which is the myth about the relationship between paid staff and volunteers. Another very strong myth. It has certainly inspired the labor movement in its opposition at times to emphasizing volunteering because they fear that this is simply a way to cut out support for paid staff in key functions. So we wanted to delve in a little more deeply into this relationship and see if it was supportable. In the course of our work, we found a very significant presence of volunteers in the workforce of the nonprofit sector. We were determined to portray the entire workforce, and we felt that it was important to treat volunteers as part of that workforce. But we also felt that we needed to express it in full-time equivalent terms. It was not simply the numbers of volunteers, but how much time, and how does that compare to full-time equivalent staff. So what we discovered is that in terms of the total workforce of the third sector across the world, about 44% are represented by volunteers. And yet, again, in the data systems, the system of national accounts made a very convenient assumption. And their assumption was that we should measure the worth of volunteers in terms of what economists call the opportunity cost. What is the cost to the volunteers of what they're giving up in order to do the volunteer work. Well, what volunteers give up to do volunteer work frequently is leisure, and the opportunity cost of leisure is zero. And so they interpreted volunteer work as a leisure activity and therefore valued it at zero, which meant they didn't have to measure it. So all of the work of volunteers in the system of national accounts was conveniently treated as zero. Well, it seemed pretty clear that that was an absurd outcome. We weren't sure what the exact figure should be, but it surely wasn't zero. The alternative way to do this is called replacement cost. What would it cost the organization to replace the volunteer? And there are various wrinkles of replacement cost that could be considered. But clearly zero was not right. And so we found 44% overall. We then compared this by region. We found that there were some significant differences. I mentioned this before. The Nordic countries, volunteers are a massive part of their labor force. So if you took that out and treated it as zero, you were missing significant parts. Similarly, in some of the developing countries. So there was significant variation. But the scale of volunteering globally, which we've been able to at least estimate, is enormous. And the fact that we weren't considering it was a real problem. So if we just do a count of the number of people who engage in volunteering, if you imagine putting all the volunteers on one piece of land, it would be the second largest population of any country in the world. About a billion people volunteering in a typical year across the world, which puts it larger than India, larger than the U.S., of course, much larger than the UK. And if you put a even conservative estimate on the value of volunteering, which we were able to do by using just an average wage, well, this is showing the numbers of volunteers compared to different employment in different countries. I think I took out the one that was the volunteer land's economic role, but in terms of its economic role, it's about the fourth or fifth largest country in the world in terms of its economic value. This is the contribution to GDP versus selected industries in Canada, 14 billion, 6 billion in the motor vehicle industry in Canada. There's more economic contribution of volunteers in Canada than there is economic contribution of their entire agriculture sector in terms of its contribution to GDP. So this is a huge part of the story of the nonprofit sector. And when we did the work for the UN, we insisted that the measurement of volunteering be included in this satellite account on the nonprofit sector. And therefore, in that document, there is a provision that says when you do these satellite accounts, include volunteer labor. The data that we've generated shows that if you treated the value of volunteering as a form of philanthropy, that is the giving of time versus the giving of cash, it turns out that the giving of cash is 32% of global philanthropy, and yet it gets the lion's share of the attention. Whereas giving of time, that is volunteering, if you put a value on it, it's 2/3 of the total. So it's twice as large in empirical terms. Again, demonstrating the power of data to challenge conceptions. So what about this notion that volunteers drive out paid staff? What can we say about this empirically? So if that were true, we would expect most countries to fall into, keep pushing the wrong button, I apologize, to fall into these two cells. That is, if we have above average paid staff, we should have below average volunteering, and if we have below average paid staff, we should have above average volunteering. Or put it the other way, if we have above average volunteering, we would expect below average paid staff among the nonprofit organizations in a country. So most of the countries, if this were true, would fall into this category. But it turns out that that's not the case. About 16% of the countries fall into this pattern that would be consistent with this hypothesis. Most of the countries fall into just the opposite. That is, if you have below average paid staff, you tend to have below average volunteering. And if you have above average paid staff, you tend to have above average volunteering. And at first this seems to be counterintuitive until you begin to reflect on what makes successful volunteering programs. And what makes successful volunteering programs is that there's a structure to it, that people are mobilized, that the work is designed and structured so that it gives the volunteer a sense of real participation, real contribution. And so this data throws a real challenge onto this myth as well. And I should note, just to complete the story about the shifts in the global machinery for measuring the nonprofit sector, that as we began to try to implement this UN recommendation to measure volunteering and include it in the satellite accounts that we got them to recommend across the world in our handbook, the countries began to push back and said, this is great, but who's going to tell us how to do this? How can we come up with a common measure of volunteering? There are many different definitions. Some countries only measure volunteering through organizations. Other countries do other volunteering that is direct. What's the definition? We have multiple definitions of volunteering. You can see even in the UK, if you trace the measures of volunteering in the UK, you can get wildly different measures depending on the definition that's used. And so we took that pushback to the International Labor Organization and went through a similar process with them that we had gone through with the UN Statistics Division. We basically pointed out to them that the UN Statistics Division has called for the measurement of volunteering. We pointed out to them that none of their labor force surveys measure this important part of this workforce. We showed them that it was 5 or 8% of the GDP, and it was bigger than the GDP of agriculture in Canada. We ran through all of these data, and we basically said, listen, you've got a real problem. You're ignoring a crucial part of the world's workforce, and you need to begin to measure it. And out of that process came a challenge from them to try to write a manual that would guide the measurement of volunteering globally, and to present it to one of their every 5-year gatherings of labor force statisticians around the world. We did that. It was submitted in 2008. It took us another 3 years of writing, and out of it now has come a manual on the measurement of volunteer work. International Labor Organization published it. We wrote every single word. Both this and the UN handbook, I often joke, are among the most boring of many boring books I've ever written, but two of the most powerful because they drive the activity and behavior of thousands of statisticians around the world. And here again, we are at work trying to get statistical offices to implement these procedures, this definition. We've designed a 1.5-page survey for measuring volunteering that can be inserted into labor force surveys. These are the most powerful surveys in the world. Every country does labor force surveys. They'll kill their social surveys. They will not kill their labor force surveys. They're huge samples. They're done on a continuing basis. If we can just get this 1.5 pages included once a year, every year, we will have suddenly enormous data. And we ask the people, did you do any work without pay in the last month? What did you do? So we have an occupation. How many hours did you spend on it? And once you have the occupation, you can quickly compute the replacement cost of that hour or 2 hours or 20 hours of volunteering. And suddenly we have a measure of the economic scale of volunteering. Okay, are we still doing okay time-wise? Should never tell a professor that, 10 minutes means 30. No, I'll do it. So paid staff does not drive out volunteers, it turns out. 7th myth, philanthropy is the chief source of civil society organization revenue. I cannot tell you how many Americans believe this. I don't know how many of you believe it. Let's see, how many of you think in the UK that, let's say, 75% of the income of nonprofits in the UK comes from charity? 75%? Any takers? How about 50 to 75%? You got to be honest. Okay, we got one person. How many think it's 25 to 50% from charity? Okay, how many think it's more like 10 to 25%? Okay, well, I think you caught the clue from what I said, but I would say that about half of you think that it's certainly over 25%. Well, it turns out that globally, the charitable portion, and I'm not happy about this particularly, but it's important to know, is really not the major source of revenue. And this is what made that UN system so crazy, because that was the assumption. The people who designed the system of national accounts thought, charities, they call it the voluntary sector, so must be supported by philanthropy. Well, the major source of support globally are fees and charges, including in many developing countries, where this sector really is sort of elite healthcare and elite universities. The second biggest source of support is government globally, 35% of the revenue. Only 12% globally is coming from philanthropy. So certainly at the global level, it is not the case that philanthropy is the major source, and this is why that, again, statistical system was so screwy and why it had to be upgraded. And it took data, is the bottom line, to get them to change their mind. We could have come to them and pleaded forever, but we came to them with data, and we had data that was generated with the aid of statistical offices in most of these countries. So when they went back to talk to their statistical colleagues, they got basically the message that, yeah, we helped these guys do these data, and they're basically right. So myth number 8 is about the U.S., because people are willing to believe that other countries have gone a different way, but definitely believe that philanthropy is the major source of civil society revenue in the U.S. And if I had asked this question in the U.S., I would say that 80 to 90% of the hands would have gone up at least by 50%, by the 50% or more cutoff. But in the U.S. as well, it is definitely not the major source of revenue. We found 2 broad patterns of finance in the countries that we looked at. One of them was the fee-dominant pattern, that is, fees were the chief source of revenue. Most of the countries of the world fell into that. You can't see this. I can barely see it. Sorry for that. This is, I think, was it 58%? 53%, 35%, 12%. So government was 35, fees were 53, pretty much the dominant pattern globally. Here are the countries that fall into that pattern. And as you can see, the U.S. is one of them. 57% of the income of our nonprofits comes from fees and charges, 31% from government, and only 12 or 13% from philanthropy. And so the U.S. is definitely in the same situation as the rest of the world probably is driving some of the figures. So that's one pattern. And you'll notice that many of the developing countries fall into that pattern, as well as some of the more developed ones, such as the U.S. The second pattern was the government-dominant one. And this was the pattern that you'll notice happens to be the one at work. We're going to definitely have to change the color of these. So in the government-dominant one, government is, the overwhelming largest source of revenue. It's upwards of 70%, 77% in Ireland, 77% in Belgium. And you'll notice one of the striking characteristics that the countries with the largest nonprofit sector are also the countries in which government is the largest source of revenue. And this again reinforces this notion that really what was created in Western Europe, particularly the northern parts of Western Europe, was not a welfare state, but really a welfare partnership. The Netherlands is clearly one of the largest nonprofit sectors and one of the ones that has enormous government support. Created this system called pillarization at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, in which most of the services were delivered and paid for by the state through a kind of voucher system. that gave individuals the opportunity to send their kids to whatever school they wanted, or whatever kindergarten they wanted, or whatever daycare they wanted, whether it be church-related or entirely secular. This was the outcome of a battle over a public school system in the Netherlands that ultimately had pro-secular versus pro-religious and value-based educators and populations competing against each other. This was the solution. The state will supply the same amount to everybody. You can use it to either support public education, or you can use it to support values-based and religious education. So this is a very profound pattern, and I think it's the pattern, in a way, of the future in countries that don't now depend on it.
Can I ask a question about what was defined as fees and charges as opposed to philanthropy? Because I know there's a lot of organisations in the arts area which I'm mainly involved with that rely on membership subscriptions, and I want to know whether they're the fees and charges or whether they're typically philanthropy.
It's a very tough question for us to deal with, and we have generally treated memberships as fees and charges. But there are different rules in the statistical system about how to treat membership charges, whether it's in a market-based system or a philanthropic one. But that's how they're treated in these data. And there are a couple of other wrinkles in these data on government, because in the system of national accounts, as it still exists, if the government pays an organization through a contract, it's treated as a market purchase by the government, and it ends up in fees. If it pays the organization as a grant, it's shown as part of transfers, and it shows up as philanthropy. So we've had to extract from these data systems the government payments, and this has been a real technical problem just to get a picture of the government funding. So the existence of the government funding has been really one of the things obscured in the data, and has required a lot of rethinking and restructuring.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Put you in the spot a wee bit, but maybe in some countries, I just wondered if I'm a member of an American organisation, and my membership is called my donation. I just wondered if there was a tax incentive in some countries to classify some memberships as charitable donations or philanthropy.
Well, probably, sure, and I think it's going to be up to the tax authorities how they treat that. I think the key is, do you get a benefit? So memberships for organizations serving for-profit companies are treated for sure as fees, and memberships for non-commercial organizations are frequently treated as philanthropy. All right, ninth, whoops, I don't know why that's up there. Did I slip into something? Okay. The ninth myth has to do with sort of the composition of expenditures and the role of capital in the operation of the nonprofit sector. And I won't go through everything I wanted to say about this, and we can come back and if we have time and questions. But this has been a real problem in this sector. This sector traditionally has not thought a lot about capital as opposed to operating revenue. Every business thinks very hard about this, but very few nonprofits think of themselves as having an operating revenue task to fulfill and a capital budget to fulfill. Investment capital is the resources that go into essentially building for the future. And if an organization simply tries to meet its annual budget every year, it will never put aside enough to grow into the future. And there is both hard capital and soft capital. Hard capital are buildings like this one, facilities, technology, and soft capital are essentially strategic plans or improving the quality of the workforce, the building up of the human capital of the organization. And this has been, I think, a historic, shortcoming of the sector that hasn't really thought hard about generating capital. And one of the reasons is that it has been disadvantaged in generating capital. And I think for a minute you can think about why that's the case. This is a sector that cannot share profits. Therefore, it has no access to what is the best source of revenue, the one that has no cost attached to it, which is equity financing. You issue shares, like Alibaba just did, and you get somebody to buy a share of your company, your organization. If you make no money, they get nothing, and you owe them nothing. And if you do real well, then you share the profits with them. So they're essentially giving you free capital to grow with because they think that you'll do well and you'll share the capital. Nonprofits cannot share the capital, cannot share the ownership, therefore have no access to the stock market and can't issue shares, and this inhibits their ability to generate capital. And yet, increasingly, nonprofits need capital, and they need capital for reasons similar to why for-profits need capital. At least we've moved into a world in which everybody needs technology, everybody needs equipment. And so we've done surveys in the U.S. We run something called the Listening Post Project, which is a regular survey of a network of nonprofits, about 1,500 across the country. And we asked them, well, do you guys need capital? Have you had a need for capital over the last year? And, zounds of organizations said, yeah, you bet we did. And we need it for all sorts of things. And then we asked them, well, did you succeed in getting it? And very small proportions told us that they had gotten the capital they needed. So there's a real capital crisis in the nonprofit sector. Not only a revenue crisis, which there also is, but a capital crisis, different kinds of capital. And we asked them questions about where they get their capital, and most of them basically said we go to banks, we go to foundations. None of them went to where the major part of capital in our societies resides. Insurance companies, pension funds, they have no access to those at all. And I've recently done another book focusing on this capital thing, because it turns out that I think something really striking is going on. I won't dwell on it, but I think that philanthropy is now in the midst of a great bang, an enormous proliferation of different sources of capital for social purpose activities, a whole new set of actors that have surfaced in the world, certainly in the UK, utilizing a whole new set of tools that don't look like the typical tools you think about when you are applying for grants from foundations. So we have capital aggregators and secondary markets and social stock exchanges and foundations operating as philanthropic banks. And they're using loans and credit enhancements and bonds and securitization and even quasi-equity. So a really significant new world of finance that I would urge all of you to get on top of. It just so happens that there are 2 new books that are available. The big one, this is the big one. It's about a 700-page book that trots you through all the new actors and all the new tools, called New Frontiers of Philanthropy. And then in an act of mercy,